Well, well, greetings and welcome. Jonathan Foust here, and thank you for tuning into this webcast. A couple announcements before we dive into something a little bit different. First of all, big thank you to the Insight Meditation Community of Washington for hosting this, and to Glenn Harrison, our producer, for getting this out to you. Also, a big thanks to our mindful movement leader, Rita Moran. If you'd like to join Rita for mindful movement, you can join her at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time, and that'll get you all prepared for this, which starts at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. You can get the link to her class on my website and on my Facebook page. Also, just to let you know, I've got a newsletter. I send out a weekly and periodically another one with a summary of my talks and best photography. And just finally, before we start, two things. I am offering a retreat on January 11th called The Most Important Thing, which is a whole process to really take you into an inquiry around what's most important in this year ahead. It's pretty juicy. And I've done this annually for like maybe the last 5 years or so. So please feel free to check that out. That's January 11th online. And finally, all of this is offered in the spirit of generosity, or dana, the Buddhist principle of dana, which basically says these practices and teachings are priceless. So don't put a price on them. So it's offered freely. I love this offering. At the same time, if you feel if you feel inspired to help support me in my lavish lifestyle and in all that it takes to produce and get these talks out, thank you so much. You can make a donation if you feel drawn through my website, Facebook page, all that kind of stuff. So that's that. So to what lies next. I'm excited to share this with you. If you listen to any of my talks or meditations or do any retreats with me, you know that I'm a pretty body-based somatic inquiry kind of guy. And a lot of my understanding around this is informed by the work of Dr. Eugene Gendlin and the whole realm and discipline of what's called focusing. And I'd like to share with you today an interview I had with Dr. Greg Madison. Greg is, in my estimation, an awesome person. He's an existential and focusing-oriented psychologist. He's a passionate focusing teacher. He's dedicated to supporting people looking to deepen self-awareness and clarity in their life. And he has a podcast called The Living Process, wherein he interviews lots of luminaries and leaders in this area of focusing and somatic exploration. I really feel honored to be part of the conversation. He's a deep thinker. He's an empathic listener. I think you'll enjoy all of his offerings, so I'm going to include information about his podcast and his work in the show notes. And as this is a pretty long interview, about an hour, we will forego the opening meditation we usually have and go right into the conversation. And Greg starts this off with kind of an overview and a summary, so I will leave all of that to him. So I hope you find the following helpful, and many blessings.
Hello, my name is Greg Madison, and welcome to this episode of The Living Process. It's Christmas Eve, and my special guest this time is Jonathan Foust. Jonathan is very well known within Buddhist communities and also in yoga. He is trained in a whole list of different somatic practices, including focusing. We talk quite a bit about how Jonathan combines his understanding as well as practice of focusing with some of these other traditions. He describes his own personal journey, which is very interesting, and he's dedicated his life to these various practices, and it really shows in the way that he interacts and the responses he gives to some of my questions. We talk a little bit about what the body is and about energy flow through the body. We also end by talking a little bit about how to bring some of these practices or an attitude of compassion to the sort of uncertainties in the world today, and how not to just jump into the divisions that we see in a lot of societies. I really enjoyed the conversation. He's a delightful man to converse with, And yeah, I hope you really enjoy this episode with Jonathan Foust. Welcome back to the Living Process. And my guest this time is Jonathan Foust. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor to be here with you.
Yeah, well, it's a real pleasure to have you as a guest. We worked quite hard to make this happen.
Yes, it took some resilience to make this happen.
It did. Um, the first thing I like to ask people, and I'd like to ask you, is particularly, I know that you have a much broader kind of sense of different traditions than just focusing. But if I start with the focusing question, I'm curious how you found focusing or got introduced to it, or your kind of journey with the focusing process.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that question automatically makes me feel old. Um, I look back, I feel like that old prospector, let's see, that was back in '83. Um, so way back when, I had been in the Peace Corps. I was teaching in a university, teaching phonetics and
Wow.
linguistics, and just to shake up my life, I attempted to be the first American to cross the Sahara Desert on my bicycle from the south, which didn't happen. And I ended up going through all kinds of crazy adventures. And I actually ended up stumbling into an ashram, literally stumbling into an ashram when I was, I think, 25. And there was this book, Jenlin's book on focusing. And I picked it up and I just read a little bit of it and I did a little reflection and I had this really powerful shift, like a really dramatic shift. And it was like, wow, there's something really, really juicy here. And then I got sucked into ashram life. And so, which was a very, very deep, deep immersion into yoga,
Mhm.
into the whole field of energy and exploring all of that, kind of maybe we can talk more about that and how the sort of how that's come into my own practice with focusing. So I kind of put the book down, got very immersed into that world, and it was a very sense-based couple decades. I like to joke, I came for lunch and I stayed for 23 years
Wow.
in the ashram. And then when my time was done and we went through all kinds of changes as a community, we had to re revisualize ourselves after we had a kind of a meltdown with our guru, our teacher, and for a couple of years I was president, and then I was done. And then I moved down to Washington, D.C., fell in love with my wife, and I remembered, oh, focusing. I want to get back to that.
Mhm.
So I did my training with Robert Lee in domain focusing, which was fantastic. And at that time, I was very deeply immersed in Buddhist psychology and sort of teaching through that lens and the just the synergy of my training, the whole felt sense of my own learning and offering it out into the world has just been fantastic. So from there, I've done a year-long training. I've done 10 times where we do a whole year of deep immersion into the practice in the context of meditation and Buddhist psychology. So that was a long response to a very, very simple question.
Yeah, I am immediately, I'm very curious about um, sort of the different avenues, if I could call them that, the Buddhist, the yoga, and then the focusing that it sounds like it came in briefly, it receded, and then it came back. And I'm curious how those three go together, if they do, or do they remain separate for you?
It's all one whole mishmash. But in essence, and what was so interesting was having that sort of like epiphany experience of reading Jenla's book and then being so immersed into the whole realm of yoga.
Mhm.
My guru's guru said that the whole world is made up of two elements. In Sanskrit, it's referred to as chitta and prana. awareness and energy.
Hmm.
And in those two realms of energy and awareness, you have the whole span of awareness from thoughts to beliefs to states to awareness itself. And in the realm of energy, we've got life force. We have the feeling tone of the life force. We have kind of the expression of life force. And our entire life is about balancing chitta and prana. So when you're two in your head, you come home, you've been wound up after a long day. What do you want to do? You're going to drink a beer, you're going to put on some music, dance around the room, work out, take your dog for a walk, do something to get the energy flowing. And then the times when there's too much energy, we're kind of over pranified, if you will, or it's strong emotion or hypervigilance. We want to get a handle on what's going. So we're going to kind of lean into more of the conceptual. So we're always trying to balance these two things out. And yoga is really about exploring the awakening of this energy. And part of what the suggestion is that energy or prana or life force or chi or ki or Holy Spirit, is it possible that it is intelligent and evolutionary?
Mhm.
And if we can deeply listen to it, is it possible that it is bringing us inexorably toward a more awakened quality of awareness?
So I'm immediately curious whether that is perhaps different language and maybe even a different understanding, but also applies to what we do in focusing when we bring our awareness to a felt sense. Is that the same as prana and chitta?
To my mind, absolutely. Absolutely. Because what happens, let's say, just to bring it back to yoga,
Yeah.
let's say you're in a yoga posture. You're in like the triangle pose, trikonasana, and you're suffering, you know. You're hanging on for dear life. You're aware of what's not moving. You're aware of what's congested, what's stagnant, and what's stuck. And you breathe into it and you relax into it. You feel into it. You get more familiar with it. And then what happens is that stagnant, congested, stuck energy will begin to move. It'll begin to shift. And then you feel the rush, the endorphin rush of that release of tension.
Mhm.
And then what happens is, again, if energy is intelligent and evolutionary, it'll go to the next place where it's blocked because it's designed to move into a sense of free flow, if you will. So
Mhm.
it's the same thing in my simplified view.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting to me. As I listened to you, I was thinking it sounds very similar, different kind of conceptualization of what's happening, perhaps, but very similar. And then I thought, are we talking about the same body? Because when you're talking about the yoga body, it sounds like in some way, I think you're talking about more than this, but in some way, you're talking about the physiological body and tension, muscle tension, but that signifies more than just muscle tension. Is that right?
Yoga describes it as the prana body.
Okay.
It's the energy body.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's the subtle body in many
Okay. So
ways.
it's that's similar to focusing then, the felt
Mhm.
sense. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And how I view it is we have this level of pure prana, of life force, which is kind of undifferentiated. It's neither good nor bad. And then, and in here, it kind of brings in sort of like the Buddhist perspective is that experience of energy is immediately experienced in one of three categories of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. In the Buddhist angle, it's referred to as Vedana. It's the feeling tone. And then, without being aware, usually we react to the feeling tone, and then that will kicks off the associations, memories, thoughts, all the reactive patterns, usually wanting to move away from unpleasant,
Mhm.
increase pleasure, and get bored with the neutral.
Yeah. So this is jumping way ahead, but I have to ask it now. Because that sounds like a very full understanding and practice. And I'm wondering what would have made you interested in kind of coming back to focusing?
A couple things.
Okay.
Um, this goes back to my own history, kind of back to the whole, living in spiritual community and this whole kind of immersed in the energetic world. I became fascinated with what does it mean to heal? So I got trained in lots of hands-on modalities, of working with energy, um, trigger work, structural acupressure, cranial sacral, and I was just fascinated by how subtly can we detect what's not flowing, bring attention to it, and then sort of track that energetic release and where it goes next. It's endlessly fascinating to me. Um, so years later, when I kind of left the whole community and I moved down to the DC area, I thought, like, how do I work with people? And part of it is, um, the hands-on work is really fun. It's also highly licensed and all that kind of stuff. I thought, well, I work a lot with people through mindfulness and through meditation. Well, here's focusing, which is perhaps even the most subtle form of this kind of work. As you contrast it to sort of like the gross manipulation of tissue, as opposed to how do we bring attention to what's stagnant, what's stuck?
Mhm.
How do we work that? And of course, that opens up this endlessly fascinating world of the power of inquiry around working with what's not fully alive.
Yeah. Yeah. Or what's somehow asking for the next step in life or something.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It's like where's the stress, where's the suffering? Or if we think of the two wings of mindfulness, one wing is the wing of wisdom. What is actually presenting right now? What is this? Can I name it?
Mhm.
And then loving awareness. How does this want me to be with it? Which are the two elemental questions in focusing?
Yeah. That's one of the things I was wondering when you were describing the yoga practice, whether there is that kind of gentle, kind, loving sort of awareness to the stuck places. Is that a part of the practice?
What's so interesting is in the span of yoga, you've got like in any tradition, and this includes both yoga and in meditation. When I first heard this, an author by the name of Jason Siff, he wrote a book called Unlearning Meditation. When I first heard this, I thought that's crazy. And I thought about it, I thought, no, it's true. He said, whatever tradition you get trained in, you can find another tradition that will give you exactly the opposite instructions. And that's so because like in yoga, you've got the intensely willful practice,
Right.
where you're, just push through the energy blocks.
Mhm.
And then you have traditions that are all around surrender, and listening and softening and flow. And my training was more in kind of in the flow realm of Kripalu yoga. But the same thing with meditation. You can do like the sittings of strong determination where you're developing that intense focus.
Mhm.
And then there are the traditions of just just trust the unfolding of
Mhm.
what's there.
It reminds me of psychotherapy because it certainly has all of that spectrum as well. But then it makes me think of focusing. In the focusing world, I wonder if in some ways we also have that spectrum, kind of from boot camp focusing to, very gentle focusing.
Absolutely. But I think, and again, this is just my perspective, is what we're really helping people to do is to find their own authority. One of the most powerful inquiries I can offer someone in focusing when we're in touch with the felt sense, we have a sense of what it is. We can sense the tendrils of it. We can sense how old it is to ask, is there a sense of how this wants you to be with it right now?
Yeah.
And I love that question because when you pose that question and you wait,
Mhm.
the most amazing things arise out of that, which is really coming from the individual's own place of authority, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to me. Um, yeah, that in the focusing practice, there is a tradition, but it's a tradition that some maybe has a slightly different role than some other traditions, in that it's not a tradition that can offer any sort of external authority about how to practice. It's only a tradition that points you to your own authority to discover what practice is right for you.
Exactly. Exactly. It points to what I think of as the pathless path.
Yeah.
And in the pathless path, we really only have two questions. What's happening right now? How does it want me to be with it? Like,
Yeah.
what's the most important thing as I'm with this right now?
Mhm.
I'm not sure there's anything else in any given moment if we really segment out our experience.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that definitely resonates for me. And I think probably in the focusing world, there's that tendency towards a kind of resistance to authority and perhaps a slight kind of anarchy that is not in any way chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I love about, of course, about Jen Lin and what I love about the old timers
Hmm.
is, I think I've mentioned this to you in an email, is like there's a sense of anarchy that I love because it really is around individual awakening.
Yeah.
There's no cookie cutter approach here at all.
Yeah. Exactly. So I'm wondering from your perspective, because you've had so much experience in these other traditions, um, what, in your view, could they potentially offer to someone that has a focusing practice?
Well, I think when we kind of look at let's just say we look through the kind of the Buddhist lens,
Yeah.
and we look through the two wings of wisdom and compassion. Wisdom being recognizing what's true, not your preference, not your embellishment, but what's true, and then really exploring how to hold it. How does this want me to be with it? The one model, which you may be familiar with, is the model. It's called the RAIN model, RAIN,
Mhm.
which is a really wonderful synergy with focusing.
Yeah.
Um, this was created by Michelle McDonald originally, and my wife, Tara Brock, kind of reworked it. She has a book out on this. And the RAIN model is very powerful. The R is to recognize or realize what's presenting. The A is to ask yourself, can I allow it? Can I accept it? The I is to investigate. And then there's sort of two versions of RAIN. The N initially was around not identifying,
Mhm.
and then Tara kind of reworked it into actually nurture, which is like calling on loving presence, and kind of ties also into domain focusing, which I studied with Robert Lee. But I find like the questions, the inquiries that arise, to recognize like what is this,
Yeah.
you know, like that, just that sense of like what is this,
Yeah.
and then can you be with it? And here always, I just encourage people like that's a deeply somatic inquiry.
Mhm.
Can
Yeah.
you be with it? Is it okay? Listen for the somatic response because it may not be the
Yeah.
right, the right, there may not be the right time. You know, there are these qualities in sort of like through the Buddhist lens of the factors of awakening. There's certain factors of awakening that are kind of required to be present. You have to have access to non-judging awareness. You have to have a quality of concentration to actually stay present.
Mhm.
You have to have a quality of curiosity to kind of want to know more. You
Mhm.
have to have a quality of what's called rapture, which is it's sort of like the joy of discovery.
Yeah.
You have to have a quality of steadiness. You have to got to have firepower. You need energy. And so that question of can I be with it? And it's a very, very simple question, but to really recognize that you may not have the firepower. You
Yeah.
just may not have the physical energy to be with it. You may not have access to mindfulness. So to if you get that somatic response, I can't be with it right now. It's too much. It's that whole idea of letting it know you see it,
Yeah.
letting it know your intention is to be with it another time when the conditions are different. Your intention is to be present with it. And it's such a powerful step that I think gets overlooked by a lot of people. We have this sense of, I just need to muscle through this. And I'm not sure that's so skillful.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Can I be with this in such a way that I don't violate at all?
Yeah. Yeah. And I love the analogy of, the felt sense is the wild animal at the edge of the woods. You can't seduce it in, you can't chase it, but you can let it know you see it. And that's such a delicate relationship. So that's the A. And then the I, of course, is to investigate. And I think we have a tendency, particularly in the West, to like have it be an intellectual investigation when the investigation here is deeply, deeply somatic. And if there is an investigation around thoughts and beliefs, it's so important to connect the dots back to the felt sense, of course.
Yeah.
And then, again, through the focusing model, when you really have that sense of what this is and the tendrils and all of that, what happens when I bring loving presence to this? And all the variations of the inquiries around that. How does this want me to be with it right now? And if I were simply to hold this in loving presence, how does it move or shift or change? So that rain model I find to be it's an incredible handle
Yeah.
for people to deeply move into more somatic inquiry.
Yeah. Very, very useful. Um, I agree with everything you've said. And a question that arises for me, which is a question to myself as much as to you or anyone else, is just why do you think it is that the body needs these particular qualities? Why is it not possible to coax or coerce or push the body or the felt sense forward? Why is it these particular kind of non-invasive yet caring, curiosity, welcoming? Why those qualities? Why is that what life responds to?
I with one of the best lines I've ever heard, I sat a couple of retreats with a teacher by the name of Sokni Rinpoche, who taught very much from the kind of the Dzogchen, the non-dual tradition. And he talked about compassion. And he said, compassion is the lubrication that allows us to let go what we know we need to let go of.
Mhm.
And I love that. I love that. There's another quote I love from a teacher of Emmanuel who said that there's not a heart in this world that would not open instantly if it did not feel safe enough.
Mhm.
And I feel like there's something to be said for, the powering through, the muscling through, the, pushing edges and building resilience. And there's a lot to be said for exploring that sense of loving presence, of that like that deep empathic listening, for so many people. And again, it's a cliche, but most cliches are true. There is an element of spiritual reparenting here, you know. Does
Well,
that make sense?
it makes sense, but it's still maybe it's not a question. Maybe I'm the only one that makes this into a question. But I still wonder, why is compassion such a powerful attitude or approach or environment for the body or for the being or for the person or for life on the one hand? And then related to that, it's always surprised me how even when someone, myself or anyone else, is really quite suffering, if with a focusing guide or anyone else, if you can invite the person to kind of take a step back into that more compassionate approach to themselves, and give the feeling some space and just be open to it, welcome it, all of that kind of language. How often it actually readily is available? Uh,
Mm.
How is it that it's almost as though we kind of make ourselves small and blind ourselves to this limitless compassion that is always there to open up to. I mean, how do you understand that?
It's a really powerful question, but I think my question for you is what works for you when you find yourself small, caught in self-preservation,
Yeah.
etc.?
That's always what works for me is immediately to give myself space, but not a kind of an objective, cold sort of clinical space, but a space that is welcoming, that has at least some caring, that suddenly I'm curious about myself as a being again. That kind of space that is totally non-critical, non-judgmental, that
Yeah.
always my body expands in response to that.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. And I think from the lens of Buddhist psychology or Buddhist philosophy, that access to heart space, that access to compassion is a training.
Yeah.
It's referred to as metta, cultivating loving kindness. It's like this little sprout that requires a greenhouse for protection,
Mhm.
because we are so trained out of it, from such
Yeah.
an early age, that negativity bias is so intense. So in classic metta training, well, there are different variations of it, but you reflect on your benefactors. You just reflect on the people who are on your side, and you just stream attention toward that. And again, you can do it intellectually, but the real work is doing it somatically. So you actually access what is it like to actually receive kindness in your life? What is it like to, when you think about people who like you, the people who laugh at your jokes, you know,
Mhm.
like to really reflect into that. And then to explore what's easy. And that's where you start with your pets, with plants, and then you just stream attention. Again, it's moving from the thought into the felt sense, and you
Mhm.
increase your capacity for it. And I remember I did a month long retreat, and the first week was on benefactor and on self, and then the next week was on focusing on the easy people, and then the next week was finding a neutral person. You just choose one person that you don't have any antipathy toward, but no great attraction. And just for 45 minutes every day, you're wishing that person well. You're wishing them ease. And I chose our retreat manager, who struck me as a kind but unremarkable person. And so every day, and about day 5 of that retreat, of that week, um, I'm just sitting, and she walked into the room, and like, my heart started fluttering. I thought, oh, my beloved has arrived, which is immediately followed by, oh my God, am I falling in love with the retreat manager? No, but like what we pay attention to gets bigger, which is again back to kind of the yogic thing of like, of how actually chitta, prana follows chitta. What you focus on, a felt sense will come with it if you entrain yourself on it.
Mhm.
And the final week is choosing the difficult person.
Yeah.
And a story I often tell is when I had my interview with the teacher that final week with someone who really betrayed me. I said, well, here's where I am in my forgiveness practice. I've come to realize I can completely forgive this person as long as I'm assured he burns in hell for eternity, which was progress.
Yes. Yeah.
And then later, actually, just a few days later, suddenly I got the role reversal. I was able to like, oh, this is what he was needing that wasn't happening. This is why he threw me under the bus. And just such an incredible rush of insight and forgiveness. So all this to say, it's a training. It's
Yeah.
it's really training ourselves to look for the good. And we each have our own path, and we each have our own wiring. You know,
Mhm.
how do we wire ourselves to loving presence? It's unique for every one of us.
Yeah. It's interesting. You use the term training, and I would use the term unlearning. And yet, I think we're talking about exactly the same thing.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
When I listen to you, I think um, it sounds to me, in addition to everything else it sounds to me very therapeutic. And it makes me wonder, uh, does psychotherapy add anything else to what it is that you're talking about?
It's a really good question. Um, for me, because my meditation practice is so central,
Yeah.
you know, um, it really is around awakening, whatever you want to call that, awakening to true nature,
Mhm.
awakening to who I am beyond a separate self. And I had a really interesting conversation with Dr. Jenlin way back when I was doing my training, one of the conferences. And I noted how in doing my partnerships and so forth, how so many people who get trained in focusing are psychologically oriented, you know,
Yeah.
and and usually what I would find is when in my partnerships that people would have some issue, some emotional issue. And as we would move into the felt sensing and naming and so forth and kind of following that model, there'd be some kind of a shift. And then as soon as there's some kind of shift, it'd be like, okay, well, what else can I focus on? And I noticed for myself, and this was my question to Jenlin, like, isn't the shift something we should really pay attention to? Because isn't that shift a shift in identity? Like what happened? Like when that when that issue dissolves along with the felt shift, what is that?
Yeah.
And it was really fun. We had a great exchange around it. And then he kind of like guided it you know, uh, back to the psychological. But I find it's sort of like, I mean, I'm really kind of sharing your question, like, what is the difference?
Mhm.
Because when I look at the model of rain, back to
Mhm.
here's what's presenting, whether it be of physical pain or emotional turmoil or mental agitation, you track it back to the felt sense. You sense, can I be with it? And you move into that investigation. I'm not sure there's a difference.
Yeah. I'm at that point as well. I keep asking myself, really, what is the difference? What is it, especially if you're a focusing oriented therapist of some kind? Um, what are we offering? I guess calling myself one of them. What are we offering that really is substantially different or in any way more than what you're describing? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure if, apart from a regular meeting and the relationship that grows from that, but otherwise, I'm not too sure. But I want to go back to what you just said. That's more interesting to me. Is I could imagine Gendlin liking the question. Um, and I think what you're saying, this is, I want to say it back to you to see if I've got it, is I think what you're saying is that you have noticed, at least at that time, and I would agree if this is what you're saying, that in the partnerships, the person that's focusing is almost looking for what is the psychological trouble that I'm dealing with in my life at the moment, and finding a way to be with that, potentially getting some kind of shift in their understanding, and then immediately looking for, okay, what else is here? Or, okay, so what's it like now? And kind of following the path of the trouble. And I think what you're suggesting is, hold on a second, something quite profound just happened there.
Yeah.
Stay longer with that shift, and who are you now? And welcome just that shift and stay with that before you start looking for any more trouble.
Yes, it's around can we sustain attention on that sort of like dissolution of the small self
Yes.
and open to the sense of what's left, the awareness itself. In
Yeah.
the model of rain, my wife talks about after the rain, which is just after you've done the inquiry,
Mhm.
slow down, check out that space, you know?
Yeah.
Like a question that I love, an inquiry I love to work with people is when they're aware of a pattern, and they sense the tendrils of that pattern. And I ask, who are you without that imprint? Wow.
Yeah.
It's so, so powerful.
Yeah.
Or if you're investigating a belief, and if you follow the model of Byron Katie, you develop, find a belief that's really core. You ask yourself, is it true? You know,
Mhm.
and then is it really true? Because the first response is, of course, because I believe it. And then what's it like when you think that thought? And in that model, so many people hang out intellectually, well, here's how I view it. But if you move from the conceptual into the felt sense, like how does that belief live in your nervous system?
Yeah.
When you sense how old it is, you sense the tendrils of how that lives inside. And then you pull out the samurai sword
Mhm.
when there's that real sense of this is how it lives on the inside, and you ask, who are you without that thought? It's just stunning. It's just stunning. And the question is like,
Yeah.
can we bear hanging out in that space?
Yeah. Yeah.
And some
So,
people can't, you
yeah.
know. I've literally had people fall out of their chair on that question. And
Wow.
some people will have some capacity to hang out there in that quality of presence, where
Yeah.
where a construct is no longer it no longer has any ground and no longer has any roots. It's
Yeah.
so exciting.
So that's an invitation to an experience of self that is no longer constricted by that identity or belief or whatever.
Yeah,
An
yeah,
invitation to the larger self, whatever you want to call that.
yeah. Well, and you can call it anything you want.
Yeah, exactly. I really like that, and I think in the focusing world, what you've said about it is exactly how I would also see it, that we don't often enough have a practice of, I think, two things. One, staying with the body that actually isn't in a state of trouble and allowing it to expand. And then it becomes, I think, a little bit closer to the spiritual practices you're describing. And the other opportunity maybe to do that is to stay with a felt sense that's positive, something that feels good, and to invite more and more of it.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. To get more familiar with kind of this unbound quality of consciousness.
Yeah,
You
exactly. Yeah.
and so and I think there's some beautiful tools that at least have occurred to me in my own practice of like helping people access their own sense of wisdom. Quite often, at the end of like a process to ask, what advice do you have to give yourself?
Mhm.
Which is just a very simple way of kind of tuning in to wisdom, if you will.
Mhm.
Or, given all that you've felt and named and everything that's shifted and moved, what's the most important thing in your life right now?
Mhm.
And then again, that sense of like listening and waiting can be so, so, so powerful.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of it is, again, when we put it back in the context of spiritual practice, if you will, I'm just reminded how in the Dzogchen tradition, which is kind of the non-dual tradition, there's a sutra which is considered like the flower. Like if you distill it all down in the Dzog tradition, it all comes down to these lines: utterly awake, sense doors wide open, utterly open, non-fixating awareness. It's
Yeah.
so powerful because it's about opening deeply, sense
Yeah.
doors wide open,
Yeah.
and cultivating that sense of non-fixating awareness or presence. And I think part of the focusing experience is we're getting tiny glimpses or big glimpses
Yeah.
as we move into this kind of inquiry.
Yeah. I love that. It makes me think of two different things. One is that if we think of the focusing practice as this gradual expanding or unfolding or blossoming or something, so that the uh, we're guided by increasing openness, that somehow that is the guide. That feels right to me. Uh, yeah.
And so there's a very cool thing, again, through this lens of Buddhist psychology, of what's called verified faith,
Mm.
you know. And verified faith is where it's not there. The kind of the opposite of verified faith is magical thinking. You know, I'll just think happy thoughts and I'll be happy. But verified faith is when you move into that openness
Mhm.
and you realize that when you are open and when you are curious and when you can access loving presence, that there's a power and a potency,
Yeah.
is that you have more and more of a verified sense of this is this is a journey, this is a technique, this is a process that works because it's worked before. And I think that's part of like the, growing our prefrontal cortex and all that stuff that happens. But just that sense of like a deepening sense of trust in in how this process of unfolding or awakening happens.
Yes. It also reminds me of the first step, as Gendon first conceived of it, of clearing a space, and how that sometimes, and I know in my own practice, when I have started with clearing a space, often I don't go on and focus. None of those things seem very important anymore. The cleared space was the answer somehow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. What's between you and feeling free is a really powerful koan,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know,
Yeah,
because you have to actually tune in to what freedom is.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. Would you see focusing as a non-dual practice?
I think it has the possibility. I really think it does. I think, there's a tendency to think that non-dual means you're divorced from your body, that it's just pure awareness without a body. When I go back to that Dzogchen Sutra, which has been around for, a couple thousand years, it's actually about awakened in the body, awakened in the felt sense. And if you look at it through the yogic perspective, it's the purified, like there's a quality of purification. Yoga talks about kriyas, and kriyas are the purification experience. It's what you call de-stressing. When you're working with the gross sensations in the body and you come in contact with like a really deep tension and you breathe into it and you kind of ride the wave of that energy and you feel it shift and move, that's a kriya. That's you just let go of something out of your nervous system. And I think in many ways, this is just a continued refined process,
Mhm.
which is like embodied wakefulness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does well, it certainly makes intuitive sense. As I listen to you, my body agrees. I'm slower, but my body agrees. It makes me curious about the way that, I mean, I don't even know exactly how to ask this question, but what somehow the way that you would bring focusing into meditation potentially, or the way that you would, in your focusing practice, emphasize particular things such that your meditation experience comes into it. How do they somehow go together for you?
If we think of mindfulness
Okay.
as non-judging awareness,
Yeah.
that's the definition that works for me, you know, non-judging awareness. And my back to the ashram days, my guru's guru said, before he went back to India at the end of his life to die, he was asked, "What's the highest quality of a spiritual seeker?" I thought for sure he was going to say, "Whatever you're enjoying, stop it. Work harder. Knuckle down." But he said the highest quality of a seeker is self-observation without judgment,
Uh-huh.
which is, wow, you try that on. It's really, really quite potent.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I think when we're in a like a meditative experience, you know, we sort of have the gross sensations, you know, and then we have all the subtle stuff going on.
Yeah.
But as I like to say, when you meditate, you feel better. You feel your depression better, you feel your sadness better, you feel your anger better. It's all there, ripe for awareness. And there's some meditative techniques that are about just focus on concentration, do not indulge, you know. Um, but then, and there's a lot to be said for like the calming practices, the concentration practices. But what I like about Vipassana in particular is when something arises that's persistent,
Mhm.
something that you intuitively feel is calling for investigation, you move from your anchor, of breath or sound or whatever it may be, to focus on the phenomena itself. And that's where the rain practice comes in.
Yeah.
Okay, let me get familiar with this. You may be familiar with the old story of the yogini in her cave, and she's just meditating, and these three demons come into her cave, and they're whirling around and making all this noise. And very calmly, she gets up, she starts building a little fire, and she's so non-reactive. The demons, they get really annoyed, so they crank it up. Horrible sounds and images, and again, it's so non-reactive. She puts a tea kettle on the fire, and this enrages them. So they throw everything they got at her. And she sets out these teacups. And finally they say, what gives? What were your three deepest wounds, your three worst nightmares? And here you are building this fire and putting out these teacups. And what's going on? And she says, well, you've been here before and you'll be here again. So in the meantime, what kind of tea would you like? That's the practice. It's how do we have tea with our demons when they arise.
Yeah.
So that's where I think this model of investigation, we can apply it on so many levels. I always love this model of at the core is what we call prana. It's undifferentiated energy. And then that gets experienced as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That kicks in thought forms.
Mhm.
If you think the same thought 1,000 times, it calcifies into a belief. If you're not aware of the beliefs in your life, they form your habits. If you're not aware of your habits, they form your character. And if you're not aware of your character structure, that's your destiny. And we can explore and investigate on any one of those levels. We can look at our habits, we can look at our beliefs, but fundamentally it brings us back to how does this live on the inside? Can I work with it energetically,
Mhm.
and catch it kind of before it proliferates?
So is this sort of a daily life practice for you as you go through your day? Do you have a way of kind of bringing yourself back, checking in with you, or?
For me, particularly with the state of the planet and the state of politics, you know, uh, I had a pretty big realization. I need to be more plugged in the presence than I ever have,
Mhm.
just with all the challenges here. So I've upped my daily sitting
Mhm.
pretty dramatically, and boy does it make a difference. It so makes a difference. And again, within the context of my practice, they're practices within practices. The practices of arriving, of concentration, and then the practices of actively investigating something that might be coming up, and the practices of just surrender and resting in presence. Um, but what's so core and foundational to me is the experience I've had in focusing, which is can I work with the gross challenges when they arise? But also, and this is where it gets really interesting for me, is when I'm beginning to open into expansive states, can I stay present to them?
Mhm.
And that's where I find the practice gets so subtle and so refined. Like there's a question I ask myself sometimes, depending on my state. Toward the end, I like to ask myself, who am I in the absence of desire? that question kind of like really kind of sets the stage for sensing just pure presence. What helps me sustain that awareness is opening to the felt sense.
Hmm.
The felt sense of expansion, the felt sense of spaciousness. Um, it's all integral, but on a very subtle level, at least in my experience.
Can I ask, through your practice, what understanding have you come to about what a human being is, what existence is, uh, what pure presence is? Have you found any way of understanding that really rings true when you're really open in the way you've been describing?
Wow, that is such a powerful question. It's challenging to find words
Yeah.
for that. Um, I do think, again, this is a stumbling quality of approach here is um, it's kind of back to that inquiry of who am I in the absence of desire.
Yeah.
It's like that. It just points toward that quality of spacious presence. And what I kind of notice for myself is the more I immerse myself in that,
Mhm.
um, the more it kind of touches into everything.
Mhm.
The less I believe my thoughts,
Mhm.
the more I'm aware of these kind of unconscious beliefs that kick in without even being aware of it. The more I'm aware of Vedana, of that feeling tone, the more aware I am of the unconscious pushing away or grasping. It's sort of like that whole idea, in the analogy of when you think of indigenous tribes who like use indigo dye. You've got this dye pot of intense blue, and you dip in the white fabric and you pull it out, you hang it up to dry, and it dries almost bone white, but a little bit of the blue, and then you dip it again. And depending on how much you dip it, it takes on it takes on the hue of the dye. And I think in many ways it's the same thing. Like wherever we point our attention, we tend to take on the qualities of that wherever we reside,
Mhm.
wherever our attention resides. Which is why I find it so powerful, and I imagine you do too. The more I immerse myself into practice, but also the more I'm in this relational field of supporting people in this inquiry, the more the more it sort of permeates my, who I am, at least right now.
Mhm.
Do you find that to be true?
Yeah, I do. But I think for me, it's moments on my own, either when I am purposely investigating with that question, once I'm in touch with the more expansive body, that question of every time I have to find the right way of phrasing it, but something like, what is this? Or what am I? And then noticing that even asking the question somehow is too small for the inquiry.
Mm.
Um, the only other time is usually when I'm on my own. I actually find it more difficult when I'm with other people, unless we're in a focusing practice or meditative kind of shared space. But like in conversation or something with other people, I can find it difficult to keep the openness in myself.
I'm curious, when you're working with someone
Yeah.
and they experience a felt shift, and part of that felt shift is into a sense of like non-identification,
Mhm.
a sense of expansiveness,
Mhm.
how do you help them sustain attention on that?
If I'm working with a client, I would simply say, let's not move on from this. Let's just stay with this. Let's welcome it. Let your body fully have this. Let it move and expand as much as it wants to. And let's just see if it's okay simply to allow that. I would say that kind of thing over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. That's awesome. That's great. Whenever I lead a meditation, I will always point toward resting in presence.
Hmm.
So many of us, we need the practice of gathering and arriving. We need the practice of conscious relaxation. We need the practice of being the witness of what's changing. But all roads ultimately point toward resting in presence. And I think it's kind of the same in a focusing session,
Yeah.
you know, is that when there are those moments where there just is that sense of presence that emerges, where the small self gets more permeable or drops away, um, to get familiar with that is just so juicy.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't happen all that often in my experience, but when it does, I certainly slow down and really encourage welcoming it. But how about when you're in a conversation with other people, not necessarily a difficult conversation where, you violently disagree about something, but just ordinary conversation. Do you have a way, because of all the practice that you've done, do you have a way of kind of gently bringing yourself back to that state of presence so you don't get too pulled into a conversation, for example, or a particular discussion?
Wow, that's such a great question. I think um, when we look through the Buddhist lens, one of the things the Buddha allegedly said, I mean, who knows what he said? Nothing was written down for a couple hundred years, but one of the things pretty emphatic about, he said, nothing is to be clung to as I or mine.
Mhm.
You know, nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. And when we have those moments when I or mine either becomes permeable or drops away, those are the mystical moments.
Mhm.
And so I kind of look for, again, in very imperfect ways that I can allow myself to become more permeable. And
Yes.
one of the questions I often will ask is, I kind of tune myself to the unmet need if I'm in conversation, to ask myself, what is this person needing right now?
Hmm.
And that's a really powerful way of sort of like opening up the field a little bit
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. What I typically do is if I'm at a dinner table, for example, is if I can feel myself getting too narrowed down into something, is I expand my awareness to the whole table and almost kind of invite myself to be the whole situation, the whole setting, rather than a separate self within it. And even though I can't completely accomplish that, it does enough to broaden my experience again.
And I can imagine or hallucinate that when you're teaching, let's say a group, that's what you're doing.
Yes.
Is you're opening to the collective,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
opens up more possibility and creativity and allowing you to bring presence to the group.
Yes, I do. I invite my body to be the room rather than myself.
Mhm.
It's helpful for me.
Yeah, yeah, that's juicy. That's one of my favorite words.
So I'm just aware of the time. I want to ask, what are you kind of most passionate about at this point in your life, or what are you developing, or yeah, anything else that you would like to add so people know about it?
Well, I have a weekly talk that I do, and my my I like to think of what I offer is what is pragmatic dharma. It's like, how do we apply these ancient teachings to the phone call you're dreading next week?
Yeah, wonderful.
That's a passion of mine. But another project I'm working on um, is something I've been fascinated with just through my own life experience, and the working title is Transforming Your Relationship to Pain, kind of a chronic pain companion. And it's about 10 or 12 attentional strategies for working with physical pain. And that's just fascinating.
Yeah.
Just really
Yeah.
there's so many options when it comes to the experience of pain that we forget because we get so locked into fear and self-preservation. So it's basically offering kind of like warm guidance in your ear to explore some different ways of working with it. And of course, emotional pain is physical pain. It can be applied, across the board. But the
Yeah.
primary thing is how do you work it when it
Yeah.
feels like it's too much?
Yeah. That sounds incredibly useful. Um, and where could people find your thinking about that?
I've got a website and YouTube channel, just my name,
Okay.
and product will probably I'm hoping will be out in the next couple months.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put your website so people can find you. Um, I have one more question, which
I'm happy to make up an answer.
okay, terrific. I'm thinking, especially when I speak to people that live in America, uh, and I mean not only America, because the whole world is suffering in kind of new ways, it feels like, although probably not very new. Um, but in America, where you've recently had this election that again seemed to really kind of divide the nation, um, do you have ways, or can you think of ways, or are you interested in uh, attempts to bring some of the things you've been talking about, whether it's things you've learned from yoga or from Buddhism or from focusing, or just the overall kind of attitude that comes with these practices? Are there ways of bringing that to the nation somehow, to the society, to groups, to the community that you think could be helpful at this point?
Mhm. It's such a rich and deep question. And I think it's interesting to watch kind of the reactivity in this culture. Because right now, so many people are burned out.
Yeah.
There's such a sense of hopelessness and such a sense of feeling disempowered, such a sense of despair. And a lot of people are just saying, we just have to wait and see, um, which is very challenging. And I experienced a lot of that myself, you
Mhm.
know. But I know for myself, and part of mine is like, again, back to those two questions of what's happening and how does this want me to be with it? For me, it's around, I need to be plugged in, you know.
Mhm.
Uh, I want my cup to be overflowing because I know that when I respond out of anger, I have a certain degree of effectiveness in the world.
Mhm.
If I can respond with compassion, it's a different degree of effectiveness in the world, you know. And I think part of it, kind of back to the old sickness, old age, and death, is really looking at, we each need to look closely at our suffering and how to respond to it. And I really do feel like we are in a big unknown in our culture right now.
Mhm.
I don't know how things will coalesce. Um, as someone said, just from a political point of view, the question is, with the new administration, will they provide customer satisfaction? Um, and if they don't,
Mhm.
then something's going to shift again. And
Mhm.
so I'm not being really articulate here, um, but I think I really do feel there is a sense of uh, how do we be with it, and no one really knows right now.
Yeah. Yeah. What I'm getting from what you're saying, partially at least, is as a citizen to take it as your responsibility to some extent to be adding more awareness rather than simply more content.
Yeah. Yeah. And as someone pointed out, you know, to be curious,
Yeah.
you know, to be curious.
Mm.
What can I learn? You
Hmm.
know, you know, the world is run by unmet needs. You know, what are the unmet needs?
Hmm.
And how do we attune to that?
Hmm.
Very, very deep and interesting times, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, it makes me subtly excited when you say it that way.
Well, you know, when people ask me how's your business, my classic response is I said, well, I'm in the suffering industry. You know, business is booming, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, we wake up out of suffering if we really if we really look at it. And I think part of, you know, I just notice how, you know how I particularly notice among folks who have like chronic issues they don't address. And as they get older and older, they become almost cartoon characters.
Mhm.
You know, in many ways, you know, like the suffering that's emerging is so chronic we can't miss it now. And it will get our attention, you
Mhm.
know, at some point. And the question is, can we respond to it?
Yeah, yeah. That's a really interesting reminder of what to watch out for in one's aging.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and I'm really
Oh,
glad.
this has been great. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you and all that you do and all that you offer and what a great resource that you are.
Likewise, and yeah, I want to make sure that people can yeah, get in contact with you.
Great.
Thank you
Okay.
very
Well,
much.
thank you. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.